I moved 500 miles away, and my parents barely cared until my sister needed $30,000. The first time my mother called me after I moved 500 miles away, she did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask whether I had found friends in my new city, or whether the tiny apartment I had proudly decorated felt like home. She didn't even ask how my first week at my new job had gone. Instead, she said, "Your sister needs $30,000. I was standing in the middle of my kitchen with a grocery bag still hanging from my wrist. For a few seconds I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. 30,000? I repeated. My mother sighed as though I had asked the most inconvenient question imaginable. Yes, 30,000. You have savings, don't you? I looked around the apartment. The walls were still mostly bare, because I had spent the previous month choosing which things I could afford to buy, and which things would have to wait. My dining table was second-hand. My sofa had a tiny tear on one arm. The only expensive thing I owned was the laptop I used for work. "Mom," I said slowly, "I moved here 3 months ago." "We know. You barely called me." Silence. Then she said, "This isn't about you." Those 5 words would stay with me for years. 3 months earlier, I had driven away from my hometown before sunrise with everything I owned packed into a rented SUV. I remember looking at the rearview mirror as the last familiar gas station disappeared behind me. I expected tears. I expected fear. Instead, I felt strangely light. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 29 I had finally accepted something I had spent most of my life refusing to see. My parents loved me, but they loved me differently from the way they loved my younger sister, Melissa. That difference had always been explained away as circumstance. Melissa was more emotional. Melissa needed more support. Melissa had made a few mistakes. Melissa was still finding herself. I was the responsible one. The dependable one. The daughter who could figure things out. For years I had mistaken being trusted with everything for being valued. When I received a job offer from a growing technology company in another state, I accepted it before I could talk myself out of it. My parents reacted with a strange mixture of indifference and irritation. My father said, 500 miles is a long way just for a job. My mother said, "Well, if you really want to leave, that's your choice." Melissa didn't come to say goodbye. She sent me a message 6 hours after I left. "Good luck." That was it. I had spent my entire adult life making myself useful to my family. When Melissa dropped out of college for a semester, I helped her organize her finances. When Dad's business had a slow year, I quietly paid one of his overdue bills. When Mom needed help after surgery, I used vacation days to stay with her. When Melissa got engaged and suddenly decided she needed a photographer, flowers, and a larger venue, I contributed money without making a big deal about it. Every time I helped, my parents thanked me with the same sentence. "You're such a good daughter." I used to smile when they said it. Eventually I realized that what they really meant was, "You're the daughter who won't say no." My new city was nothing like home. It was louder, faster, and anonymous in a way I found comforting. Nobody there knew that my sister had always been the center of family conversations. Nobody cared that my father thought my job was just office work. Nobody expected me to attend every family dinner or solve every small crisis. At work, I was hired as a financial operations manager for a company called North Star Systems. The salary was better than anything I had earned before, but I didn't suddenly become wealthy. I was rebuilding my life. I paid rent. I paid student loans. I contributed to retirement. I built an emergency fund because I had learned early that emergencies rarely waited for convenient timing. Every dollar had a purpose. That was why my mother's request felt almost absurd. $30,000, I said again. What happened? She became quiet. Melissa made a business investment. I closed my eyes. What kind of investment? It doesn't matter. Mom, if you're asking me for $30,000, it matters. Her voice sharpened. Your sister is in trouble. How? She signed a contract she shouldn't have signed. I leaned against the counter. Is she being sued? Not yet. Does she owe the money? Yes. Then why are you calling me instead of talking to a bank? Another silence. This time it lasted longer. Because you're family. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly understood the pattern. Family meant Melissa's problems became my responsibility. I asked my mother what Dad thought. She said he agreed that I should help. I asked what Melissa thought. She's embarrassed. I asked whether Melissa had called me herself. She doesn't know how to ask. That was when something inside me changed. Then she can learn, I said. My mother's voice became cold. Claire. I'm not giving her $30,000. You have it. That doesn't mean it belongs to her. You're acting selfish. I stared at the grocery bag on the floor. 3 months earlier I would have apologized. I would have transferred the money and told myself it was temporary. But I had spent 3 months alone learning how peaceful life could be when I wasn't constantly waiting for someone else's approval. Mom, I said. I moved 500 miles away and you barely noticed. The first time you call me, it's because Melissa needs money. I'm not doing this anymore. She hung up without saying goodbye. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later my father called. He didn't raise his voice. Dad rarely needed to. His disappointment had always been more effective than anger. Your mother says you refused to help Melissa. That's correct. You know what she's going through. I know she made a financial decision that didn't work out. Families don't abandon each other. I sat at my desk staring at the spreadsheet on my laptop. I'm not abandoning anyone. You're leaving your sister without a safety net. Dad, I was never supposed to be her safety net. He exhaled slowly. You always had more sense than Melissa. Exactly. Then act like it. That sentence stayed with me, because for the first time I heard what he was actually saying. My competence was not being appreciated. It was being used as leverage. A week later Melissa finally called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was crying. Claire, I didn't want Mom to call you. Then why didn't you call me? Because I knew you'd say no. I looked out the window. Rain was streaking the glass. At least you're honest. She sniffed. I made a mistake. What happened? She told me she had invested in a boutique fitness studio with a friend. The business had opened badly, membership numbers were low, and the landlord was demanding payment. Her friend had already withdrawn. Melissa had personally guaranteed part of the agreement. How much do you actually owe? I asked. She hesitated. 30,000. Exactly 30? About that. Melissa. 32. I closed my eyes. Why did Mom say 30? Because she didn't want to scare you. I almost smiled. She wanted to make it sound smaller. For the next few minutes we talked like adults. I asked whether she had spoken to an attorney. She said no. I asked whether she had reviewed the contract. She said her friend handled most of it. I asked whether she had business records. She said some. Then she asked, so you'll help? I'll help you understand the situation. That's not the same thing. No, it isn't. Her crying stopped. You really changed after you left. I wasn't sure whether she meant it as an accusation. Maybe I finally stopped trying to keep everyone happy. Mom says you're becoming selfish. Mom can say whatever she wants. Melissa was quiet. Then she whispered, I wish I could be like you. That sentence hurt more than the others, because I realized she didn't actually want my money. She wanted the security she believed my life represented. And somewhere along the way, our parents had taught both of us that security came from me. I offered to review the documents with her, but I would not pay the debt. She agreed. Over the next week she sent me photographs of contracts, emails, invoices and bank statements. I noticed something strange almost immediately. The business had received more money than Melissa claimed. Several large payments had been made shortly before the studio opened. They weren't listed in the expense summary she had shown me. I asked her about them. I don't know, she said. My partner handled the account. Who was your partner? Her name is Dana. Where is Dana now? She stopped answering my calls. I told Melissa not to sign anything else and to speak with a local attorney. I also told her to preserve every document. She agreed. For the first time, I thought perhaps this wasn't simply a story about my sister making a bad decision. 3 days later, my father called again. This time his voice was different. What are you telling Melissa? I'm telling her to get legal advice. She doesn't need lawyers. She might. You're making this more complicated. I stared at the files on my screen. Dad, where did the money go? Silence. What money? The money that isn't appearing in her records. His response came too quickly. I don't know anything about her business. Then why are you worried about my involvement? He hung up. That night I barely slept. The next morning I opened the files again. One invoice had been issued by a consulting company. The company name was familiar. It belonged to a man named Richard Hale. Richard had been one of my father's business associates years earlier. I didn't know why his company was involved with Melissa's studio. I searched through the documents Melissa had sent. There were 3 payments to Richard's company. The amounts were not enormous individually, but together they represented almost half of Melissa's initial investment. I called her. Did you know your business paid Richard Hale? Who? Richard Hale. She went silent. My dad knows him. Are you sure? Yes. Did Dad introduce you to Dana? Another pause. Yes. My stomach tightened. I asked Melissa to send me the original business proposal. When it arrived, I noticed something even stranger. The proposal had been revised after Melissa signed it. The version she had showed me had a clean summary page. The original file metadata showed an earlier version with different ownership percentages. Melissa was supposed to own 60%. The final agreement gave her only 35%. Did you approve this? I asked. I signed what Dana gave me. Did you read it? Not carefully. She began crying again. I thought Dad had checked it. I said nothing. Claire, why would you think Dad checked it? Because he told me he did. I felt a chill move through me. That evening I called my father. Did you review Melissa's business contract? No, are you sure? Of course. Because Melissa says you told her you did. His breathing changed. She misunderstood me. What did you mean when you told her you knew the agreement was safe? Claire, you're digging into something you don't understand. Then explain it. He didn't. Instead he said, your sister needs help, and you're turning this into an investigation. I looked at the documents on my desk. Maybe because someone gave her $32,000 worth of problems and expected me to pay for them. He became angry. Watch yourself. I'm watching very carefully. He hung up. The next morning Melissa sent me a message. Dad wants me to stop talking to you. I asked why. She replied. He says you're trying to destroy the family. That was when I knew we were close to something important. People don't usually panic when someone is simply wrong. They panic when someone starts asking the right questions. I hired an attorney in my new city for myself, not for Melissa. Her name was Rachel Morgan. I gave her copies of everything. She spent 2 hours reviewing the documents before saying, there are inconsistencies here. How serious? Serious enough that your sister should not negotiate alone. I told her about my parents. She listened without judgment. Then she asked me one question. Do you have any reason to believe your father benefited from these transactions? I thought about the payments to Richard Hale. Not yet. Rachel nodded. Then don't accuse anyone. Gather facts. That advice became the foundation of everything that followed. I contacted an independent forensic accountant through Rachel's firm. We traced the business payments. The money had moved through several legitimate-looking accounts before ending up in a holding company. That holding company was partially owned by Richard Hale. But there was another owner. A woman named Patricia Bennett. My mother's maiden name. I stared at the report for several seconds. That's my mother. Rachel looked at me carefully. Are you sure? Yes. I suddenly remembered something from childhood. My mother had once mentioned a small investment company she owned with a friend. I had never paid attention. She had always said it was insignificant. It wasn't insignificant. The holding company had received consulting fees from Melissa's business. Those fees were then distributed to its owners. My parents had not simply watched Melissa make a bad investment. They had helped structure the investment in a way that redirected some of her money through a company they controlled. I didn't know the full reason yet. But I knew enough to stop believing their story. I called Melissa. I didn't tell her everything immediately. Do you know whether Mom owns a company called Bennett Advisory? I think so. Did she ever mention it in connection with your business? No. Did Dad ever tell you that your business would use a consulting company? He said the consultant was experienced. Who recommended him? Dad. There it was. Melissa was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Claire, she finally whispered. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to find out exactly what happened. My own parents? I don't know yet. But you think they took my money? I think there are financial transactions involving their company that you were never told about. She began crying. I didn't tell her to calm down. I didn't tell her everything would be fine. I simply stayed on the phone. The following week changed our relationship forever. Melissa stopped defending our parents. She began sending me every document she had. Together with Rachel's help, we organized the records chronologically. The pattern became clearer. My parents had encouraged Melissa to invest in the studio. They had introduced her to Dana. They had recommended Richard. They had assured her that the business plan was solid. They had also received consulting fees through a company they controlled. When the studio began failing, they panicked because Melissa's personal guarantee could expose the arrangement. But there was still one question I couldn't answer. Why did they need my $30,000? Rachel found the answer in a document Melissa hadn't understood. The landlord wasn't simply demanding repayment. A settlement deadline had been established. If Melissa couldn't meet it, the business would be forced into a formal dispute. That process could expose its financial records. My parents didn't need my money because they wanted to rescue Melissa. They needed the money because they wanted to close the problem quickly. My father called me that evening. You've gone too far, he said. I was sitting at my desk with Rachel's report open in front of me. I haven't gone anywhere. You're interfering in your sister's business. She asked me for help. You're putting ideas in her head. No. I'm asking questions. You think you know everything because you moved away and got some fancy job. I let the silence sit between us. Then I said, you know what's funny, Dad? What? When I lived 500 miles closer, you never cared what I thought. Now that I'm 500 miles away, suddenly my opinion is dangerous. He didn't answer. I continued. Did Mom own part of the company that received money from Melissa? Another silence. Dad, you don't understand business. Then explain it. You're making accusations. I'm asking questions. Your mother and I were trying to help your sister. By receiving money from her company without telling her? That money was for legitimate consulting. Then why wasn't she told? He hung up. I sat there for a long time staring at the phone. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. There was a particular kind of grief that came from discovering that the people who had raised you were capable of making decisions you never imagined they would make. The next morning my mother called. Her voice was soft. Claire, your father says you're investigating us. I am reviewing documents. Why are you doing this to the family? Because I think Melissa was misled. She made her own choices. Did you tell her about your ownership in Bennett Advisory? My mother didn't answer. Mom, we were going to tell her. When? When the business succeeded. So she only deserved to know when you were making money from it. That isn't fair. No, it isn't. She began crying. For years that sound would have broken me. This time it didn't. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood that someone's tears could be real without making their version of the story true. Rachel advised Melissa to pursue a formal review of the business arrangement. I encouraged her to make her own decisions. I refused to become the person controlling her life from 500 miles away. That was important. I had spent years rescuing my sister. I wasn't going to replace our parents' control with my own. Melissa hired an attorney. The attorney requested records from Dana and Richard. Within weeks, more information surfaced. Dana had received a referral payment connected to the consulting arrangement. Richard's company had charged fees significantly above market rates. My parents' holding company had received payments they described as legitimate consulting income. Nothing about it was simple enough to call a single crime. But it was ethically ugly and financially damaging. More importantly, Melissa had not been given the information she needed to make an informed decision. Then we found the most important document. It was an email from my father to Richard written months before Melissa invested. The subject line was simple: family arrangement. In the email, Dad wrote that Melissa was eager to prove herself, and that she would trust family guidance without asking too many questions. I read that sentence 3 times. It wasn't just about money. It was about how they saw her. And how they saw me. Melissa was the daughter who could be guided. I was the daughter who could be used. My parents had built an entire family system around those assumptions. I sent the email to Melissa. She called me immediately. "I can't believe this." "I know." He said I wouldn't ask questions. "I know. I feel stupid." "No. I signed everything." "That doesn't make you stupid." She started crying. I said, "You trusted people who were supposed to protect you." She was quiet. Then she said, "You always protected me." I swallowed. I tried. "I hated you for it sometimes." "I know. I thought you were judging me." "I wasn't. I know that now." We didn't speak for several seconds. Then she said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For letting everyone make you responsible for me." That sentence broke something open inside me. I realized I had been waiting my entire life to hear it. Not because I needed an apology, because I needed proof that she finally understood. The business dispute eventually moved into mediation. My parents were forced to disclose their financial interests. Richard's company was removed from the arrangement. Dana agreed to provide records in exchange for being released from certain claims. Melissa's studio closed, but the settlement prevented her from losing everything. She still owed money. She still had to rebuild. But the $30,000 she had asked me for was no longer necessary. My parents had wanted me to pay the price of a problem they had helped create. Instead, the truth made them confront it themselves. 6 months after our first phone call, my father asked to meet me. I agreed. Not at home. Not at a family dinner. At a quiet restaurant halfway between our cities. He looked older than I remembered. For the first 10 minutes he talked about practical things. The weather. His business. The drive. Then he finally said, "Your mother and I made mistakes." I didn't respond. We thought we were protecting Melissa. From what? Failure. I looked at him. And what were you protecting yourselves from? His eyes dropped. That was the first time he didn't have an answer ready. Finally he said, "We were afraid the whole thing would collapse." It did. I know. You just wanted someone else to absorb the consequences. He nodded. I know. I expected anger to come rushing back. It didn't. Instead I felt something quieter. Distance. Not 500 miles of highway. Emotional distance. The kind that comes when you stop needing someone to become the parent you wished they had been. Dad looked at me. "You really don't need us anymore." I thought about that. "No," I said. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you." His eyes became wet. "That's worse somehow." I almost smiled. Maybe because now caring is a choice. We sat there in silence. Before we left he asked, "Can we fix this?" I answered honestly, "I don't know." It was the first completely honest answer I'd ever given my father. And it was enough. My relationship with Melissa changed too. She moved slowly. She took a job with another company. She paid down her debts. She stopped asking our parents for permission before making decisions. She also stopped expecting me to solve every problem. For the first time, we became sisters instead of roles. My mother struggled the most. She kept trying to explain what happened. She said she had only wanted the best for Melissa. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said families make complicated decisions. I believed that she hadn't intended to destroy our relationship. But intention wasn't the same as consequence. I told her that. She cried. I didn't. Not because I had become cold. Because I had finally learned that forgiveness and access were different things. I could forgive her someday without giving her control over my life again. A year after I moved away, I returned to my hometown for Thanksgiving. The house looked smaller. The dining room looked exactly the same. The same wooden table. The same framed family photographs. But I was different. Melissa arrived late and sat beside me. Mom served dinner. Dad made a joke that nobody laughed at. For a moment everything felt painfully normal. Then Melissa looked at me. You know what I realized? What? You moving away was the best thing that happened to our family. Mom looked up. Melissa continued. Not because you were gone. She smiled faintly. Because everyone finally had to figure out what they were doing without you. I laughed. Dad shook his head. You two are enjoying this too much. Melissa looked at him. Maybe. For the first time in years, the table felt balanced. Nobody was asking me to fix anything. Nobody was comparing us. Nobody was quietly calculating what I could provide. We were simply eating dinner. Afterward, I walked outside. The air was cold. I looked up at the house where I had spent most of my childhood trying to earn a place I had technically always possessed. My phone buzzed. It was an email from my new employer. I had been promoted. I smiled. Not because my parents would finally be impressed. Not because Melissa would finally understand. Not because anyone had finally admitted I was worth something. I smiled because the person who received that email was the woman I had become after leaving. The woman who had driven 500 miles with no guarantee that anyone would miss her. The woman who had learned to say no without explaining herself. The woman who could help without rescuing. The woman who could love her family without sacrificing her future to prove it. My mother came outside. She stood beside me. I used to think you leaving meant you didn't need us anymore, she said. I didn't. I know that now. We stood quietly. Then she said, I wish I had called you just to ask how you were doing. I looked at her. So do I. She nodded. I can't change that. No. But I can do better now. I believed she meant it. Whether she could actually do it was something time would decide. And that was another lesson I had learned. Promises were words. Patterns were proof. I didn't need to hate my parents. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to make them suffer because they had finally suffered the consequences of their own choices. What I needed was a life that belonged to me. 500 miles away, I had built one. And for the first time, when I looked back at my family, I didn't see a daughter who had been abandoned. I saw a woman who had finally stopped abandoning herself.